Hi, my name's Katie and I'm a knitting prodigy. Okay, not really, but can you believe I only started knitting back in April this year? And I have already very successfully, might I say, knit my very first sweater, or jumper, as I would say in Australia. Indeed, I have made a whole video documenting the whole process of me back when I had only been knitting for 3 months, deciding that I was ready to cast on for my very first garment. And I just couldn't quite believe I had gotten to that point so quickly. I thought in my head when I started knitting back in April that it was going to take me like a year to feel ready to knit something so big, so complex, and yet at only 3 months into my journey, and I was ready, and I ended up with a very successful jumper. So in this video, we're going to walk through all of the knits, all of the projects that I completed prior to attempting a jumper, all of those projects that got me to the point where I not only felt ready to attempt my first sweater, but actually set me up for success. And so this video is kind of partly me showing you my early projects, but also kind of low-key putting a curriculum together for you. And I reckon if you follow this curriculum or, adjust it for yourself, do something similar, you too could be ready to knit your very first jumper in just 3 months. Even if you've never knit before. Even if this is your very first time knitting, I reckon you can do it. So I have 10 projects here that I'm going to walk through, make suggestions for actual projects that you can do too, with each one introducing you to 1 or 2 different new skills and techniques that will not only build up your capacity as a knitter, but also your confidence. And I am someone who has tried to learn to knit a handful of times across my life, and it's just never really stuck until this time. And this time I have had a very different approach and a very different perspective. So we're also going to talk about that throughout as well. Some of the literal kind of like mindset shifts that have helped me actually learn to knit this time. Before we get to the list proper though, there is one thing that I wish I had discovered sooner. And that is the lovely folks over at the Knitting Circle, your online resource for all things knitting. The Knitting Circle is an online community filled to the brim with instructional videos, step-by-step how-tos, tips and tricks, and even knitting patterns from a host of friendly and knowledgeable instructors who walk you through demonstrations and provide tips and tricks that truly could only come with a certain level of experience and expertise. Like I said, I wish I'd found this platform right at the beginning of my journey, because there are some videos on there that answer the silly questions that I just didn't even know to look for. For example, this lesson from Jen Lucas about figuring out which way to knit if you've set your knitting down in the middle of the row and you're not quite sure which end is which, what's front and back. A lesson on there from Mary Beth Temple about how to read a ball band, like the information that's provided about yarn and what to make of that information. Also, Michelle Lee Bernstein, where were you when I was attempting lace for the very first time? Her video on fixing basic yarn over mistakes would have saved me in my first attempts at lace work. The Knitting Circle has got your back. And so if this sounds like it might be the community, the platform for you, you can head to the link in my description for your first full year of Knitting Circle Premium for just $1.49 USD. Valid for new members only. Thank you so much to the Knitting Circle for saving my lace work and also for sponsoring this video. But with that, we're going to dive right into my curriculum. The stuff that I literally knit that put me in the perfect position to be able to successfully knit my first jumper within just 3 months. And so I don't want to promise that if you follow this curriculum in 3 months' time, you'll be ready to cast on your first jumper. But I do think that at the very least, the approach that I took here, I think will set you up for success. And primarily that approach was largely inspired by 2 creators that I have watched for a long time that aren't knitters primarily, that have also learnt to knit in the last few years. I think in particular, Lena's willingness just to dive right in and to try stuff and to mess it up, but to learn from those mistakes. And then Mara, similarly, but with a little bit of a different perspective. I think it was her approach on picking projects where she could learn 1 or 2 new techniques and keeping track of those techniques as successes in and of themselves, regardless of how the actual item turned out. And I would recommend, whether you follow this curriculum or not, keeping track of that for yourself, because you'll be surprised by just how many skills and techniques you rack up and how quickly. The other thing I wanted to add is something that I heard from Breathing Yarn. She described the difference between learning to knit and crochet as almost primarily being how different the learning curve is. Learning to crochet is relatively easy, like learning the basics and kind of getting started is relatively easy, but it's harder to learn the more complex skills and to continue developing. Knitting is the opposite. Learning to just knit and purl and to hold those bloody needles, those absolute basics of knitting are the hardest part of learning to knit. And so I want to encourage you to just stick at it. If knitting is something you want to learn, the first 2 or 3 months are the hardest. So with that, brace yourselves. We're going to start really simple. The very first thing I knit is this. It's just basically a square or a rectangle, I suppose. And so this is not necessarily like a pattern or anything, right? For project 1, what I would suggest is to just knit. Just knit. In particular, I follow the instructions on like literally the basics of how to knit from Sheep and Stitch, which I'll leave a link to in the description box below. There's going to be lots of links in the description box below. And I just picked up some cheap yarn from somewhere local and easy to get to, some cheap needles, and I just knit. Now, a lot of people will tell you to knit a scarf for your first project, and essentially like this is the same concept, right? Where you just want to be knitting and literally kind of just getting used to the needles in your hands. But I would personally steer you away from knitting like a big, long scarf because it's just too big. It's too much. In fact, one of the things that I think has ultimately stood me up for so much success is the fact that all of these projects are small. All of them were finished in like a few days to a week, maybe 2 weeks, which not only made me feel like I had momentum and like I was like actually finishing things, I was actually making things, which kind of helped me keep up my motivation, but also finishing things and like getting to actually bind off and, you know, take a step back and have a look at what you've actually made. That I think is how you get a sense of like what's working, what's not. Having that moment of actual reflection on a piece that is done, there's so much opportunity for growth and learning in and of itself right there. So I would suggest knitting something like this, which has ended up being like a blanket for my tiny little dog, Ollie. Just knit something relatively small. It doesn't even have to be this big. Just kind of knit back and forth until you start to feel like you're kind of getting the hang of the movement, the motion of knitting. Just getting comfortable with the needles in your hands and the motion and starting to understand what you're creating when you're doing these loops and pulling the loops through. That's all I want you to focus on for this very first project. And if you end up with something that you can, like your cat or your dog can use as a blanket, or I don't know, just something to hold on to and reflect on in 6 months' time and see how much you've improved. Doesn't really matter. Here we're just getting used to the needles. That's it. Okay, project number 2 is an actual thing. You're going to make an actual thing. How exciting. And for me, this was driven actually by a need. I had a pretty severe hand injury and I wanted to learn how to make fingerless gloves to keep my hand warm. And it turns out fingerless gloves are actually a pretty good option for beginners. In particular, there is this YouTube tutorial by Nimble Needles, which teaches you how to essentially just knit a tube flat with a hole in it for your thumb. I don't actually have any of these around anymore because I gave away a few of them as gifts because they weren't horrible. I actually made fingerless gloves. And so with this, even though it does end up being a tube, you are not knitting in the round. So it's still very simple. It's basically knitting one of these, but you'll also learn how to do a little bit of ribbing, which means knit and then purl, knit and purl along in the row. Obviously with this, you're also creating like a hole for where your thumb will go through. So here you're learning to do a little bit of a bind off and then cast on in the middle of your knitting. It's a backward loop cast on from memory, and it's much easier than it sounds, I promise. It's only a few stitches and Nimble Needles walks you through every step of the way. And because this is only a small project with not like tiny needles or anything, it's something that I knit. I think I knit the first glove in a couple of days and then the second one a few days. So it took me about a week. And in 1 week, I had my very first finished object. It felt so good. And no, they weren't perfect. They weren't the prettiest things in the world, but they were functional. They functioned as gloves. I could use them. Next up, and I knit a few of these actually, I have them here to show you, the Fingerless Mittens Knit Flat from Knitting House Square, which is also a YouTube tutorial. This one, however, actually, can you see that? Has a thumb. So you're still knitting these flat, so you don't have to worry about magic loop or knitting in the round or anything just yet, but you are learning quite a few new techniques with this. Obviously, you're going to have to knit a thumb gusset, which means you're going to have to learn how to do some increases. Now look, increases sound scary, but they're basically just knitting with a little bit extra going on. You're still just making loops and doing that sort of stuff. You're just having to do them in a slightly different way. And in this tutorial, again, you'll get walked through all of that. Specifically, you'll be learning how to make one left, make one right, and make one purlwise. And at first, you literally will just be like following along and just trying to get through each increase. But you repeat these increases, these 3 increases quite a few times. And so at some point, you'll start to like try to pay attention to, and I encourage you to try paying attention to like the differences between them. Like knit the make one left, the make one right, and have a look at what it's actually doing and just try to start to observe and learn from that. So I made a couple of these, and as like these red ones I made for mum and she wears them quite often. These purple ones were just a test run, but I ended up keeping them for myself and I literally wear them whenever I go birding and it's too cold. So again, an entirely functional, like still functional to this day, 6 months later, item that I finished within my first 2 weeks of knitting. Amazing. For project number 4, we have the infamous Sophie scarf. Now, I wasn't aware of the discourse around this. I just knew that it was a scarf that people said beginners should try to knit. Now, I don't agree that this is a good beginner project, like first project, at least for people like me. There are obviously people in the world who are more than happy just to dive right into the deep end. But I feel like if you're here watching a video like this, that isn't you. And for me, at least, the Sophie scarf, the first time I knit it at this as my 4th different kind of project, it was still challenging. It was challenging, and I worry that if I had have started with this, I would have been overwhelmed. Like the cast on itself would have been too overwhelming and I would have given up. But as my 4th project, entirely doable. So Sophie scarves are cute little scarves that are actually quite functional, I think. I know some people think they're silly, but I suppose for a not horribly freezing kind of place like Melbourne, they're great to have. This project will build on your new skills of increases, as well as for the very first time doing decreases. It was also the first time that I followed a written pattern rather than just a video YouTube tutorial, which is like a skill in and of itself. The Sophie scarf written pattern is very clear, very easy. And then, of course, the other thing, which is kind of a very core thing to the Sophie scarf, is the I-cord edge. And now for the actual bind on, like the beginning of this was for me the hardest part. There are tutorials online kind of walking you through how to start this scarf, which if you're having trouble like I was, definitely look up. Once it clicks and it seems really easy. But if you've never knit this before, it is a little bit weird. You kind of feel like you're doing something wrong even when you're doing something right. So if you need a little extra help, it is out there. The other thing I will say, and I think probably beyond like the increases, decreases sort of actual technical skills, I would say that the biggest skill that the Sophie scarf helped me begin to develop was keeping track of my knitting. It really highlights the importance of keeping count and learning to count and beginning to learn to read your knitting, because you have to do increases and decreases at certain intervals. I think it's like every 8 rows or something. And look, if you do it on the 10th row instead of the 8th, it's not the end of the world, but the shape of your scarf will be a little wonky. And learning to count and to read your knitting is an essential skill. So definitely take this opportunity to begin developing it. After the Sophie scarf, I wanted to try something similar but a little bit more complex. And so I went for the Stay Toasty scarf by Veronica Lindbergh. This is also like a small kind of triangular scarf, but it's got some texture in it. And although this does mean that it's a little bit more like thinky, you have to actually think about what you're doing, especially when you're learning. I actually discovered in making this that I preferred having a little bit of texture, a little bit of interest while I'm knitting, rather than just knitting back and forth. I found this a lot more fun. In terms of new techniques, well, first of all, this is a written pattern with a chart. This was the first time I knit from a chart. And now, I know that is terrifying to a lot of you. It was terrifying to me. However, 2 points in favor of the Stay Toasty scarf being the perfect thing to knit as your first like chart knitting is that it is a very simple repeating chart. It doesn't take up the whole fucking page with like 30 rows and 50, like it's not like that. It's something you can print out and see very clearly, or, you know, just have even on your phone, you would be able to see the entire chart pretty clearly on your screen at once. So it's not going to send you cross-eyed too quickly. The other thing is that Veronica Lindbergh does have a video tutorial. It doesn't detail like the specifics of like how many stitches, how many rows, because for that you need to buy the pattern, but it does walk you through all of the techniques. So if you're a little bit confused, a little bit stuck, it's very helpful. And overall just does make, you know, approaching this scarf feel a whole lot more accessible and achievable, which it was. I loved knitting this. I have knit several Stay Toasty scarves. Again, they're just a little scarf, but so handy just to keep you a little bit cozy and warm. Another thing that you can finish in a few days if that's all you're doing, or a week or two, like depending on your own pace, but it's not a huge commitment that feels overwhelming. Again, this will really help you continue developing your skills of reading your knitting. In terms of specific techniques, you'll learn SSK and knit 2 together, some other decreases that we haven't done before, but again, that Veronica does detail in the YouTube tutorial. You'll also slip one with yarn in back for the first time, which is a really long acronym and looks really scary, but it's not. It's easy, but you still get to check it off as a new technique. We're taking all the gold stars we can in this learning process. Okay, number 6, I was going to show you but it's on Ollie and she's fast asleep. So I'm not going to wake her up. I'm sorry, not even for you. I'm just going to have to direct you to a vlog where I knit the Edinburgh Seamless Dog Sweater. This is by CalicoKnits and it is a written pattern, but also comes with a free YouTube tutorial. And this was a little tricky, but again, entirely doable. It felt like every single new project was intimidating, but achievable. And I feel like that is the perfect kind of trajectory. And obviously, if you don't have a dog, I'm sure you can make this for a cat or a friend's pet or find something similar. The reason though that I chose to do this project now is because I decided it was time to finally tackle my fear of learning to knit in the round. It's such a core skill. I mean, you can knit without ever learning to knit in the round, but I feel like so many modern projects, especially when it comes to garments, you're probably going to have to get there at some point. And it feels like one of those terrifying big things. And yet once you get it, it's really not that hard. So I will say for this that obviously there are a handful of different ways that you can knit in the round. I would just encourage you to try out 1 or 2 different methods and just try to find a way that you can enjoy knitting in the round. Just take your time and let yourself fail and bungle it up a few times. But I promise you'll get there and all of a sudden it'll feel like second nature. And I do feel like knitting a sweater for Ollie was a great project to test this out on for the first time because it wasn't tiny. I feel like learning to knit socks just felt too scary because the stitches and everything is so tiny and the needles. It didn't feel too fiddly. But it also didn't feel like I had to master it for a huge garment. I do really think picking relatively small things that you can finish in a week or 2 is the way to go when you're first learning. So ultimately, this felt like a really big turning point in my knitting. Learning to knit with Magic Loop just opened up the floodgates of what was possible. And although it was tricky for maybe the first week, like seriously, once you get it down, all of a sudden it's doable. And in fact, I actually really enjoy Magic Loop now. Can you believe it? Okay, we are well over halfway now and we've got so many techniques under our belt. This time I thought it was worth going back to some fingerless gloves, but this time trying to knit them in the round, now that I had that skill down. And so I knit a few pairs of these kind of gloves. Actually, these are the ones that I made for my partner Blair. He picked out the yarn. Purple is his favorite color. A man of taste, what can we say? So I'll put them on, but they're a little bit too big for me, okay, but they fit him perfectly. These are the Friends Fingerless Mitts by Danny Sunshine. This is a written pattern with no YouTube tutorial. This was the very first time I knit something with no visual cue. Obviously, I could always look up YouTube tutorials or kind of like little guides for particular techniques if I needed a little bit of help or reminding, but for the most part, it was just me and the pattern baby. But we did it. So this was obviously kind of me trying to develop my skill around knitting in the round, particularly Magic Loop, because these look quite similar to the, where are they? I'm making a bit of a mess. These look quite similar to the gloves that we knit previously, but with these ones, you stitch them up the side, whereas these, they come off the needles in a tube. In particular, knitting that thumb in the round was definitely a little fiddly, but it really helped me improve in terms of my Magic Loop. For this, you also are having to set stitches on waste yarn for the first time. So for the thumb, you kind of set them aside and continue working on the hand and then come back to the thumb later. And that also means you have to pick up stitches in here. Just 3 or 5. You can do it, I promise. And picking up stitches is another kind of scary thing, at least it was for me, but it's definitely a technique that once you get it, it's so easy. It's just knitting. It's just knitting. I feel like everything is just knitting once you get it. So I think starting with something small and achievable, approachable, like just 3 or 5 stitches is definitely the way to go. And before you know it, you'll have some really great little gloves. Okay, for project number 8, we're nearing the end. I wanted to tell you about my first big failure. Now, I did document this, so I'll leave a link to the video where I kind of spoke about this whole journey in the description box below. But basically, I was getting a little bit too big for my britches and I decided I was going to attempt lace. Just simple lace, basically just like knit 2 together, yarn over, like just a kind of strategic use of increases and decreases. Like I thought I could do it. And I attempted this scarf. And what I found is that I was capable, literally, of knitting the lace. But what I really struggled with was reading my knitting, understanding where I was at, counting the rows, that sort of thing, and importantly, figuring out how to correct mistakes. Whether it was tinking, like unknitting, going back, or like laddering down and correcting something, that I was so far from mastering. And so I'm telling you this as like a little, like it's okay to fail. I ended up just having to frog that and knitting something else. But just trying that was such an important, incredible experience because it really highlighted where I was not developing enough and what I needed to focus on if I wanted to move to that next level. And primarily that was really learning how to count and read my knitting, and then also the correcting, the being able to fix mistakes. Now, obviously I don't know how to fix like a lot of things, like more complex things, but I'm talking about just like pretty basic things. Whether it's like, oh, I purled instead of knit 3 stitches ago, I need to go back and correct that. Or I purled instead of knit a few rows down, I need to ladder down and fix that. Or I dropped a yarn over. What do I do? So having identified that massive gap in my knowledge, I decided to knit another scarf, but something a little bit different. And this time I went for the armor scarf. Now this is in that video that I just mentioned, and the pattern is by Anchor Strick. And the reason I picked this is because kind of like the Stay Toasty, it's like got a bit of texture. It's a little bit something more to it than just stockinette or garter stitch, but also because the pattern is like kind of offset, it's changing every few rows. Like it's repeating, but it's shifting. You really have to count and like figure out where you are in your knitting to know what comes next. And that's a skill that I wanted to develop. And I wasn't ready to develop that while attempting lace, but I already know how to knit and purl. And that's all this is, just like in different orders. And so I wanted to kind of like push myself to really properly start to learn those skills. And also when I did discover that I'd made a mistake, rather than like trying to fudge it or figure, oh, it doesn't really matter, like actively going back, ripping back, whatever I needed to do to figure out how to fix it. So that's what this scarf was for me. There were also a couple of like new techniques that I developed as well. In particular, there was a make 4 left, which was tricky and weird, but again, it's just knitting, as well as a decrease 4 left. Bit fiddly, but again, just knitting. So between my failed lace scarf and this, I feel like I really pushed myself to start learning those core skills that I would need to even have the confidence before I went on to something bigger. And so I just wanted to mention that here to really encourage you to do the same, because those are essential skills. I honestly think aside from just literally learning how to knit and purl, learning how to read your knitting and tink, the next 2 most important skills. After I finished my armor scarf for myself, I ended up knitting another scarf, this time for a friend. And again, I have a whole video detailing this because it was a request for her birthday. I found this pattern called the Coral Reef Scarf, which uses knits and purls in different orders to kind of create this almost like fake cabling kind of effect. On this, I learned how to make one left purlwise, make one right purlwise, knit 3 together. Again, all of these are just different variations on the same thing. And this is where I started to learn that knitting really is just knitting. Sometimes you might stick the needle into the back loop instead of the front loop. Sometimes you might like, whatever. It's still just knitting. Truly, once you've got the knits and the purls down, you're right to go. For this though, I really focused again on just improving my capacity for reading my knitting, because obviously this pattern changes a lot throughout like the process. Figuring out where I was in the knitting, really focusing on that skill, focusing on the skill of tinking and correcting my knitting if and when I made a mistake. And then also really starting to pay more attention to my tension. It was a pretty big project. It took me quite a while, but I feel like by the end of this scarf, I had really improved on all of those core skills that I was focusing on. Okay, now finally, project number 10, the project just before you decide to cast on your first ever sweater. We're finally almost there. Before you do though, I don't have a particular pattern or project to recommend. Instead, what I would love to suggest is that you go back and knit something that you've already tried. So whether it is another pair of gloves or a Sophie scarf, the Sophie scarf was it for me, another Stay Toasty, one of the patterns that you knitted like earlier on that was really challenging, but you did it, good for you. I would say just give it another go. Get some yarn and knit another one of these items for yourself. And if you're anything like me, you will just be absolutely gobsmacked at how much you have improved. For me, this was knitting a Sophie scarf, another Sophie scarf. I'd knit one for a friend and her friend had loved it and wanted one for her birthday, so I made one for Mary. And I hadn't knit a Sophie scarf in quite a while. And so like I've got mums here that I was so proud of when I first did this. And yet I just remember so clearly knitting Mary's Sophie scarf and just how easy it felt all of a sudden. Doing that cast on that I found so tricky at the beginning, doing the counting and keeping track of where I was at, reading my knitting, correcting anything that went wrong. Although I think that was the other thing I was surprised by. I don't think I made a single mistake, which was just wild to me because so much of my knitting journey up until that point had been figuring out what I'd done wrong. It was just incredible to see how much I'd improved, like very, very literally in front of my eyes, seeing how much better my knitting was and how much easier this all felt. And this is literally like just 10 weeks after having knit the Sophie scarf for the first time. It was just wild to see how easy something that once felt borderline impossible had become in such a short space of time. And so I know it might seem a little silly, especially if you don't have a gift in mind like I did for Mary, but I cannot recommend this step enough. The level of confidence I felt was like borderline concerning. All of a sudden, I could conquer the world. I was a prodigy knitter. I just felt so ready. You know what I mean? Any doubts that I had that, oh, I'm not good enough, I don't know that I'll be able to do this, were just blown out of the water when I knit another Sophie scarf, because it was just so clear to me. Like it was indisputable, like how much I had truly improved and just how far I'd come in such a short time, which is why just 1 week later, I did the thing. I did the thing and cast on for my very first ever jumper. Now, there are so many different options for your first jumper pattern, but the one I ended up going with, and I'll tell you why, is the Drop in Dream sweater by Julia Piro. And I just couldn't be happier. I couldn't be happier with how it turned out. Again, there's a whole like video of like the project, the journey that we went on. I'll leave a link in the description box below. The reason I chose this jumper is because it looked like a nice jumper that I would actually want to wear, but it also looked approachable and achievable. And there is a written pattern that you pay for, but there's also a full, very detailed, very thorough YouTube tutorial that Julia goes through, walking you through literally every single step. And she's so thorough. Like it's not just a quick 10-minute, 20-minute, oh, this is kind of how you do these parts. It's like knitting it up with you basically. And that just gave me the confidence I needed to feel like I could tackle such a big project. The other thing that's so helpful about Julia's pattern in particular is that she has all these little schematic drawings for each step of the process. So you really understand what it is you're making and why. I never felt like I was just blindly following someone's instructions. I genuinely felt like I was making something and I understood what part I was working on and what I was doing. And I think that's so important because I suppose the other skill that I learned is how to construct a jumper. You know what I mean? Like that's a skill in and of itself. And Julia, her schematics and her tutorial helped me get there. Now, there were a few new techniques that I still had to learn to make this jumper. I didn't want to go into something not learning anything new because I discovered that learning 1 or 2 new things for each item was part of the joy for me. And so while this was very easy, borderline too easy, I'm not going to lie, I did still have to learn how to do German short rows, and they're like one of the first things you do. So I was scared, but they're so easy, or at least the way that Julia explains them and walks them through in the video. So easy. The only other brand new thing to me was an Italian bind off, which is optional. And like there's lots of really great YouTube tutorials for that as well. And it was just like, you could just do a normal bind off that you've been doing on all of the other kind of items that you've done. Or if you feel fancy and you want to learn something new, you can do an Italian bind off. Everything else in this jumper, if you've done all of these other projects, you've done before. But obviously tackling such a big project for the very first time is kind of scary. And so it was just wonderful to feel like I was prepared. I was ready. And that's exactly what I did. I did the thing. I did the thing that I thought wouldn't even be within the realm of possibility for me for like the first year at least of knitting. I started it literally like on my 3rd month anniversary of starting to learn to knit, and I had finished it within a couple of months of that. So here I am, having started knitting 6 or 7 months ago, and I've knit all of this. I've knit a jumper. I even went back to that lace scarf pattern and I did it. Are you kidding? I mean it when I say that I think the first couple of months of knitting are definitely the hardest. And I would say at about the 2.5 month mark, that's when it sort of felt like my capacity as a knitter really kicked into gear, which obviously like I'd knit quite a lot of things and it felt like quite a decent amount of time. And yet in retrospect, 2.5 months, that's it. That's all it really took to learn how to knit. And now I kind of feel like I could knit anything. And so I hope this has given you a little bit of direction, a bit of guidance, a bit of help in your own journey to learning to knit. But most importantly, I hope it shows you what you can do, what you can achieve in a relatively short time span. I think especially focusing on like picking a new project with 1 or 2 new techniques that you get to learn, picking relatively small things that you get to finish and then reflect on within a reasonable amount of time without burning yourself out on something big and ridiculous, and really focusing on the important things like learning to read your knitting and learning to tink and correct. Developing your confidence in those areas. I know it feels like a slog at the beginning, but before you know it, you'll be making a jumper. And when you get to the end of something like this and you get to wear it and people are like, oh my God, did you make that? Like, I don't think I've ever had so much confidence or been so proud of myself in my entire life. I'm 35 years old and this is just like the best thing I've ever done for myself, truly. So I would love to hear in the comments below if you're learning to knit and where you're at. A big thank you, of course, goes to my wonderful patrons over on Patreon, and especially big thank you to Livia, Haley, and Belinda. And thank you again to the Knitting Circle for sponsoring this video. The link is in the description if you want to check that out. That is all from me this week. I'm going to go keep knitting. I'm working on some socks right now. Can you believe I'm knitting socks now? Knitting is just so much fun. So until next time, so much love and happy knitting. Bye. Oh, also, did I entirely fail to address the fact that I chopped all my hair off? Yeah. I hope you like it. I'm obsessed with it. It feels so good.